So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the industries and roles that are built specifically for fractional work. If you haven't already watched my other videos on fractional work, do look for those videos. The first is on what fractional work is. I explain it all. And the other video talks about how to know if fractional work is right for you. So definitely check those two videos out. So in today's video, what we're going to do is talk about industries that are currently really well primed for fractional work and the roles that are also really well primed for fractional work as well. The reality is that not all fractional work is created equal. Fractional CFO can name their price. If you're a different type of fractional executive, you might not necessarily be in that position and have enough cachet in the market to be able to do so. So really important that you have clarity on which industries and which roles make sense so that you can position yourself strategically if this is something that you're considering. So in today's video, I'll talk about 5 industries with the most fractional professionals and why that's the case. I'm going to be talking about roles and seniority levels that command the best fractional rates. And I'm going to be talking about the intersection of industry and role that creates premium opportunities and industries and roles where fractional work doesn't yet exist. It might change in the future and why you should avoid them for now. So if you don't know me, my name is Ada Ofunri, and I have over 20 years experience of building engineering and quant teams for hedge funds and tech companies. I am currently a fractional talent partner to hedge funds, prop firms, and AI startups, and I help them on their talent strategy. A lot of recruiters I know who've gone on to start their own companies are increasingly offering fractional services in their niche areas of expertise. And so I'm going to talk a little bit from the perspective of my experience as a fractional executive, but also from the perspective of what I'm seeing in the market more generally as well. I'll also talk a little bit about the Fractional Opportunity Matrix, where the industry meets role, and to create basically the optimum opportunity possible. So let's talk a little bit about the industries where fractional work really kind of thrives. These are sectors that dominate fractional hiring because they have very specific characteristics. And so let's talk a little bit about what actually makes an industry fractional friendly. So the first is that they're high growth and they're capital intensive. So this is where you have companies that are scaling very fast, but they also want to be able to control their fixed costs. Tech startups that are raising funds at multiple levels would be a really good example of that. The second is industries where you have project-based or cyclical work. So these are people who from time to time might need spikes in specific expertise, but they don't need that expertise throughout the course of the year. A third characteristic in the sort of industries that for where fractional work thrives, where specialized knowledge is required. So these are companies that don't really want to hire a generalist, or a generalist wouldn't do well in that role, and so they're looking specifically for specialists. And then the fourth thing is that it has to be an industry where people are willing to pay premium rates. So the margin structure supports high hourly rates or high daily rates or retainers. So as a counterexample, industries where fractional work isn't necessarily thriving at the moment include retail or hospitality or manufacturing, industries where there's relatively low margin, perhaps stable headcount needs. And so companies will tend to prefer full-time loyalty in those industries than bringing on fractional experts. So now that we understand some of the characteristics that these industries need to have, let's dive deeper into the 5 industries that are currently prime with fractional workers. So the first is technology, specifically startups, specifically AI first startups. Fractional works here because funding tends to come in lumps. So if you're seed stage or series A, B, C, etc., you need to build fast and stabilize. There's board pressure to extend your runway. So bringing in fractional experts helps to keep your burn rate down. And you need many different functions temporarily. For example, your go-to-market strategy, compliance, talent scaling, etc., and the high margin support premium rate. So some of the most common titles that you'll see for fractional executives within this space include fractional CFOs. So these are the most common. Every startup will need a CFO eventually, and they might not necessarily be in a position where they need a full-time CFO. CMO or head of growth. So, from early sort of pre-seed stage all the way through to Series A, fractional head of talent and recruiting, which is what I do. So this is particularly important for companies that are scaling. A lot of startups are able to hire the first 10, 20, maybe 30 people through their connections and through the reputation of, their investors. They're able to pull in talent that way. But then they get to a certain point where they've exhausted their sort of networks, their referral networks. And at that stage, typically when they hit 20, 30 people, they need someone who can come in and help scale their hiring from 20 to 50 or 20 to 100, 200 people. And that's where a fractional head of talent comes in, because it's not just about bringing on people so that you have bodies on seat doing the work. It's actually the sequencing matters and how you orchestrate the whole process matters. So that's where talent strategy comes in. Fractional CTOs, of course, if you're putting together a startup, having a fractional CTO makes a lot of sense. But typically, a lot of startups will have a full-time CTO. It might be that the fractional CTO is there as a bridge to as the full-time CTO. And then another role that is typically highly sought after in the startup sphere is a fractional general counsel or compliance person. So particularly within fintech and health tech, you need these people as you start the company. So real life examples or case studies of where fractional executive will come in is an AI startup raises $50 million in a Series A funding round, and they need to hire 40 engineers in 12 months. This is probably beyond the capacity of the founders, and they need to bring in a senior head of talent on a fractional basis to basically just sort out that problem. So they'll bring in, for example, a head of talent for 3 days a week, or 2 days a week for the first 6 to 12 months or 9 months, whatever. And this person can actually come in, build a recruiting function, hire the first couple of recruiters, hire the first couple of heavy hitting roles, and then transitions out. So if you were to bring on a full-time head of talent as a startup, this will probably, cost you somewhere in the region of 300, 400, 500K, plus in a full-time role plus equity, right? But if you bring them on fractionally, because they're only working a proportion of the week or a proportion of the month, it could cost 150, 180, and you still get the job done, as opposed to double or triple times that for a full-time hire. So, that would be why companies would bring on fractional expertise. So now let's look at the second industry where fractional talent tends to thrive, and that is within financial services. So I'm talking hedge funds, proprietary trading firms, asset managers, etc. So the reason why fractional expertise works here is because very specialized knowledge is required. So you need people with, specific domain experience or systematic trading or quantitative research. Also, for a lot of companies, let's put aside the multi-managers for a second and I'll go on to talk about them. But for a lot of companies in this state, in this area, they've got cyclical hiring needs. So if they're looking to launch a new strategy or they've brought on board a new portfolio manager and they need talent really quickly, then, they might want to bring on a head of talent. I keep talking about talent because that's my domain. That's what I know. The other thing is that, hedge funds have high margins, right? So if you're, $3 billion AUM fund, you can afford to bring on board experts with premium expertise. And, a lot of companies with less than 100 people, maybe less than 150 people, don't really need a full-time head of talent function. Sometimes they don't if they're looking to stay small. So bringing in someone fractionally makes sense because they can, for a period of time, handle what you need handled, and then you don't have to worry about them full time. So within the hedge fund, financial services, prop trading industry, some of the roles that you'll see a lot of are fractional head of talent, so these are people that usually have a deep network of talent, and they've got domain knowledge and they've got experience of scaling companies. Again, fractional compliance or regulatory execs, for example, for crypto companies, etc., those tend to do quite well. Again, fractional CFOs and COOs for emerging companies tend to do very well, as well as the tech role. So fractional head of data, fractional head of infrastructure. These are people who will come in and help to build out their tech platforms, their quant and trading platforms. So they tend to do very well. So again, using the head of talent example, the fractional head of talent example, if a systematic fund is launching a new equity strategy and they need, eight quant researchers and 5 quant developers in the next 18 months, you could hire a full-time head of talent at 500K for the year, plus bonus, plus equity, plus etc. 12-month search to bring the person on board. Or you could get a fractional person in for a couple of days a week, and they'll start immediately and begin to deliver your hires, and they can exit once you get the full-time person or once you've built out your teams. So here you get the expertise without the long-term commitment. You can scale up or down as you see fit. Now, the multi-strategy funds I mentioned earlier, your Citadels, Millenniums, Balyasny, companies like that, they rarely use fractional support because, especially on the talent side, because these people have state-of-the-art hiring machines. They're people, they have huge hiring teams and they're hiring all the time. But if when it comes to the single manager funds, say 500 to 3 billion AUM, these tend to be more kind of open to fractional support. The kind of talent that would struggle in this area is if you're somebody with a generalist skill set, so you haven't got deep domain knowledge, and you can't really speak the language of companies within financial services, P&L, Sharpe ratio, etc., then you don't tend to do well. But if you've got deep domain knowledge and a deep expertise within that, then you'll tend to do well as a fractional exec. The third industry is professional services. So think consulting, legal, accounting firms. The irony here is that these are the firms that invented fractional work in terms of consulting assignments, but they now hire fractional talent. And this is because they've got a project-based revenue model, and so they've got lumpy staffing needs. And so for the specialized practices that they'll need niche expertise in the short term. So examples are, M&A search needs tax specialists, compliance audit season needs extra pair of hands for people who really know what they're doing. So some of the specific fractional roles that are in demand in this sector include fractional practice leads. So if the company is looking to stand up new service lines, fractional business development or salespeople who can help expand into new markets, fractional chiefs of staff, so they can support managing partners during transformation, and subject matter experts in, I don't know, AI, blockchain, regulation, ESG compliance, etc. So it may not, this fractional execs may not necessarily work for some of the large consultancies, because again, like the multi-managers in financial services, they'll have their hiring machines, they'll have a deep body of expertise within the organization. They're typically quite large, so they'll be able to sort themselves out. But for mid-sized consulting firms who are wanting to build specific practices, so for example, they want to build out an AI practice, this could work really well. So they could bring in a fractional head of AI practice for, say, 12 months or so, design offerings. The person could help design offerings, hire teams, win the first few clients, and then they can transition into a full-time leader for that practice. The fourth industry where fractional roles thrive is within healthcare and life sciences. So fractional talent thrives here because of the regulatory complexity that you have within healthcare and life sciences. They need experts, right? So who can help with submissions, clinical trials, compliance audits, etc. And the clinical trial life cycle also means that the hiring needs have a stop and start cadence. And also the biotech funding cycles are similar to the sort of other tech startups. And a lot of the explosion in digital health has also meant that a lot of fractional opportunities are being created. So examples of roles that are highly in demand for this space include, say, a fractional chief medical officer who can help an early stage biotech, or fractional VP of clinical operations to help with trial launch phases, fractional regulatory and QA leads, fractional heads of talent, again, scaling clinical teams. So an example here would be a Series B biotech entering phase 2 clinical trials. They need a VP of clinical ops to design the trial protocol, hire CRO, manage vendors, etc. So this person comes on board for like a 6-month engagement and then hands off to the full-time hire. So that tends to work very well. And then the fifth and last industry area that I'm going to be covering today is private equity and portfolio companies. So fractional talent works really well here because the general PE playbook is to buy a company, fix it fast, sell it in a number of years, 3 to 5 years. And so portfolio companies tend to need transformation expertise in the short term. And they have so they need to bring in this expertise so that they can help with the sort of transition. So roles that tend to do well here include a fractional CFO, look at the books, financial cleanup, make it audit ready, prepare for exit. A fractional COO, so people who can help with operational transformation. Fractional chief HR officer, so helping with culture change, leadership development. Fractional CRO, helping with sales turnaround. So an example here would be a PE firm buys a $50 million revenue software company with messy financials. They bring in a fractional CFO for 9 months to clean up the books, implement systems, maybe even hire a permanent CFO. And then the PE firm has fractional CFOs that they can deploy across their portfolio as they buy companies and are fixing them to sell. So let's talk a little bit, now that we've covered the industries, the 5 industries that are doing really well in terms of bringing on board fractional clients, let's talk about the roles that command really good fractional rates. So, I think it's important to be aware of this if this is something that you're considering for yourself and your career. Fractional roles at the moment tend to be primarily within 2 types of areas, either within very senior leadership roles or within specific niche skill expertise. And you tend to have people that have a lot of experience, say 10 years plus. I'm always hesitant to use experience to judge capability, but for argument's sake, typically people with 10 plus years experience. And it's because with fractional work, companies are looking specifically for expertise, not just an extra pair of hands. And oftentimes fractional work tends to be strategic, not just tactical. And if it was just an extra pair of hands or they just needed capacity support, then it makes more sense to hire entry-level people or mid-level people because those are cheaper than fractional people, generally speaking, in the market. The sweet spot tends to be either C-level execs. We've talked about CFOs, CMOs, COOs, chief head of HR or chief talent officers, etc. Either those roles or VP and head of function roles. So these tend to be very common at a fractional level as well. And then I mentioned before, the third area would be individual contributor specialists, people who have really kind of niche defined skills in specific domains. So the sort of niche individual contributors that can thrive in fractional work are, for example, if you're a machine learning engineer with FPGA experience, perhaps you could be a fractional contributor to hedge funds. If you're a fractional sales force architect, you could work across a multiple range of organizations, leveraging your Salesforce expertise as an example. So the sort of roles that do well with fractional work, I'd say the first one is definitely finance leadership. So the king of fractional work at the moment is fractional CFOs. Because every company ultimately needs a fractional CFO, needs a CFO eventually, whether fractional or not. And this isn't just to take care of the books and take care of what you have, but also strategically plan for the future as well. And so, for a lot of companies, it makes sense to bring in this expertise as early as possible so that they can help with fundraising prep, financial modeling, board reporting, audit, management, etc. There are other roles I think that are within this financial domain that could also work well fractionally, like fractional controller or fractional head of finance operations, but the CFO is the one that is king at the moment in this space. And these people are commanding 10, 15, $20,000 per month on retainers for working 1 to 3 days a week. And the people who tend to do well here are former Big Four alums, ex-CFOs from successful exits, as well as finance leaders who've got startup experience. So those tend to do really, really well. The second category of people who are thriving with fractional work are people in my space, talent and people leadership. So your domain, if you have a specific domain experience, it allows you to really go deep. And this really works fractionally because hiring tends to be cyclical, especially with startups who are experiencing growth spurts, fundraising triggers, if you're a fund, new strategy launches. So instead of bringing on a full-time head of talent, that will, cost a lot of money, particularly if you've got less than 100 people or less than 100 people, 150 people, it makes sense to bring on someone fractionally who has specific deliverables from, building out the talent function or making the first few critical hires or training the team, etc. So they do that work and then they can exit and hand over. So for another role that works really well for fractional work is the CMO role. I see a lot of fractional CMOs on LinkedIn. So this is marketing and growth leadership. It works really well fractionally because early stage companies, particularly if they're pre-Series B, they rarely need a full-time CMO, but their marketing strategy is really, really critical. It often tends to be episodic. So for example, if they've got a rebrand or they've got a launch, or they've got new market entry, a CMO ahead of growth is really, really valuable. They can help set the strategy, hire the team, and then hand over. So when companies tend to need fractional marketing leaders are if, for example, the product market fit is achieved, and so they need to scale growth, or they need their first marketing hire because the founder can't do everything, right? Or the marketing team does exist, but maybe they're mid to junior level, and so they need strategic direction. Or when they're rebranding or repositioning a project, then a fractional person can come in again on a couple of days a week, on a monthly retainer, helping with marketing strategy, channel mix, brand positioning, hiring the team, etc. Then the kind of people who do really well with CMO fractional roles are former VPs and CMOs at high growth startups, for example, specialists within specific channels like SEO or paid acquisition, etc. Those tend to do very well. I forgot to talk about the sort of people that do very well in the head of talent roles, or the head of the people leadership roles. These are people who are former in-house talent leaders, and have a track record of building teams and have domain expertise within certain industries. So let's move on to the fourth category of role that is thriving fractionally, and this is technology leadership. Of course, technology leadership would be thriving, particularly within the tech sphere. This is where you have your fractional CTO or your fractional VP of engineering, and it's tricky. It is tricky for these sort of technical roles to be fractional, because you could argue that engineering leadership requires daily presence, so it's hard to do part-time, and because they're going to be reviewing code quality, technical depth, team management, it's ongoing. It tends not to be episodic. But if you've got very early stage startups and they need support with technical direction, or maybe the founder isn't as technical and so need someone to come on board with who's a heavyweight who can help set the direction, then it makes sense. They can also help with hiring the first few engineers. Sometimes you have situations where the technical co-founder parts ways with the other co-founders, and so you need a bridge CTO before you find a permanent person in that role. Or if there's specific projects like an architectural design, for example, and you want to bring on a fractional VP of engineering to sort that problem out. So that's when that tends to work very, very well. And the people who succeed here are ex-CTOs or deep specialists within specific niche areas that can come in and add value. And then the fifth role are fractional COOs or chiefs of staff. And they work well fractionally because a lot of operational transformation tends to be project-based. So for example, if you're redesigning your processes, and the chief of staff roles in startups are often temporary, and PE portfolio companies need operational cleanup support in the short term. So fractional ops leaders that tend to be hired when there's rapid growth and is causing chaos in companies, post-acquisition integration, and the founder needs a strategic partner, but not really a full-time COO for the moment. So again, a few days a week, monthly retainer, formal consultants from places like McKinsey or Bain, or ex-COOs from scaling companies tend to do really, really well here. So we've talked a little bit about the different types of industries, and we've talked a little bit about the different types of roles that do really well fractionally. Let's talk about the intersection of those two things. So I want to talk about some of the hottest intersections you'll find when it comes to fractional work. So CFO or CTOs within tech and AI, those tend to do very, very well. That's a hot intersection. A head of talent within financial services and or technology, again, that is a very nice intersection. Happens to be my niche too. CFOs within healthcare, again, that's another intersection that does really well because the regulatory complexity there really creates value. And then COOs within private equity portfolio companies, because there are multiple transformation projects going on at the same time. So that intersection does really well. And then CMOs within technology/AI, those tend to do really well as well. So, as much as we've talked about the intersection that works really well, let's talk a little bit about industries that aren't necessarily doing well right now when it comes to fractional work. And that might change in future, but at the moment, at the present time, they're not necessarily bringing on loads of fractional people. So large companies, the Fortune 500s, they hire full-time everything. They've got the internal bandwidth. There might be exceptions if they've got niche projects, but these, they have the bandwidth to bring on board full-time talent. Government and education. These types of companies tend to have procurement processes. So these tend to favor full-time or larger consultancies rather than fractional talent. Non-profits with some caveats. So this is usually around budget constraints. They might not be able to afford fractional talent. There are some exceptions because you do get some nonprofits that are very well funded, but generally speaking. Retail, hospitality, manufacturing, I talked about them in a previous video. So these tend to have low margins, so prefer full-time members of staff who can be more loyal. A lot of the operational work requires the daily presence, so it's not really practical when it comes to fractional work. If we look at roles that at the moment aren't necessarily working well fractionally, these tend to be non-specialized individual contributor roles. So entry to mid-level can work across a broad range of things. You haven't yet developed an area of expertise. Roles that require daily operational presence. So if you're in a customer service role or a sales role or HR generalist role, you might have to interact with different types of people every day. So it might not necessarily lend itself to coming in a couple of days a week on a fractional basis. And roles that don't necessarily require deep institutional or market or domain knowledge. So you find that those don't really do well at the moment when it comes to fractional work. So we've talked a little bit about all of these different areas, the markets that make sense for fractional work, the roles that are doing well, the markets that aren't doing well when it comes to fractional work, and the roles that aren't necessarily suited to fractional work. Let's talk about some of the emerging areas because I think that that's extremely exciting. And it might be that, you've not heard your area being called out. So these are the areas that are definitely up and coming, and we should see more fractional executives over the next 3 to 5 years. So the roles that are gaining traction are fractional chief AI officer. So, how companies deal with AI is still emerging, but, it's expected that a lot of companies will definitely need someone at a senior level who can define AI strategy for that organization. It may not need to be a full-time role yet, so it could do really well fractionally. Another area is head of revenue operations. So if, for example, you're a SaaS company that's looking to scale, then bringing on a fractional head of revenue operations could really make a difference. Definitely an emerging areas around sustainability and ESG. So bringing on a fractional sustainability and ESG officer to help with some of the regulatory pressure that companies might face, particularly in Europe. Fractional chief information security officer is another one. So cybersecurity is critical, one that companies can't ignore, but they might decide that they don't necessarily need that information security strategy help and support full time. And another one is head of people analytics. So increasingly, human resources and hiring is becoming more data centric. And so people who can build analytics functions, train teams and then exit, this could work really well fractionally. And what's kind of making these be really interesting emerging roles within the fractional space is that is due to regulatory and market pressure. Specialized expertise for these roles are in short supply. The areas that can have clear project deliverables, and also in a lot of cases, companies might not necessarily be able to justify full-time costs yet. So I would say that if you're somebody who is considering fractional work in any of these areas, I would say that it's really important to position yourself at the right intersection. So it's not just sufficient to have the right role, but to be in the right industry for the sort of fractional work that you do is also critical as well. So a critical mistake that people tend to make is be too broad. I'm a fractional executive. I work with anybody, that it doesn't really kind of lend itself really well to fractional work. If you're somebody who can say, for example, I'm a fractional head of talent for systematic funds, like I am, or I'm a fractional CFO for pre-seed, for pre-series A health companies, that tends to position you quite nicely because it's immediately clear who you help, what problem you solve. You can build your reputation within a narrow niche. We often talk about, inch wide, mile deep. Your referrals become more targeted and you can charge premium rates for your specialization. So if you're someone thinking about this, think about what your role is, the specific industry and stage that you support, and the companies that are doing specific things that you can also support in your area of expertise. Um, the second thing is that if you've now identified your core area of expertise, identified the specific niche industry that you support and the stage at which you support industries in, it's important to build your domain credibility. The best way to do this is on LinkedIn, right? So if you're writing posts about your industry and your specific function, then increasingly people get to know you for this. You should definitely be joining specific industry groups and making a concerted effort to be introduced to your target companies, to people who work within those target companies, and really making a name for yourself in those industries. Then you also want to be paying attention to companies that are going to be funded because those are growth signals. If a company is receiving, going through a funding round, then chances are they're going to need to hire, they're going to need a CFO, they're going to need all of these functions that they didn't necessarily need up until that point. So well worth paying attention to it. So I hope you found this video helpful. Fractional work isn't necessarily evenly distributed across industries, even though it's an area that's really growing. It's clustered around high growth companies that need expertise and are able to afford the expertise. Senior people at the moment dominate the fractional market, particularly CFOs, CMOs, and heads of talent. And where you get the most premium opportunities are where the industry and role intersect. The role that's highly sought after in a particular industry that needs that expertise, that's where you get the premium opportunities. And so it's worth picking your lane, building your domain credibility, and watching out for growth signals if you're somebody that's looking to kind of thrive in this area. So, I'm excited. I think the fractional economy is growing fast. We're going to see a lot more people getting into this space. But I think for the people who are going to do really well, it's important to understand what your domain is and to position yourself accordingly so that you can really maximize your opportunity and command the premium rates and justify the premium rates that you're after. So it could be you if you if you choose the right intersection. If you're somebody who's trying to figure out your fractional positioning, I work with mid to senior professionals on their career strategy, particularly within financial services and technology. And a lot of these people are seeking fractional transition. So you'll find a link in the description about how to connect with me. But if you DM me on LinkedIn, that's usually the easiest way. In the next video, I'll go more into fractional work. So definitely like and subscribe if you like this and you found it interesting. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.